Hello, this is a lecture on autonomous morality using MacIntyre's essay Notes from the Moral Wilderness from 1958. My name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm a professor of philosophy at Providence College. And what I'm going to do in this lecture is to introduce the fact-value distinction in relationship to the concept of autonomous morality and explain how it shows that the Stalinists it has the same moral position as liberal morality and explain what that means for us today. So to begin, MacIntyre's essay is about the Stalinist and the moral critic in 1958. And what he wants to do in this essay is to draw a parallel between the Stalinist and the moral critic of Stalinists. The motivation for this discussion was that many liberals left Stalinism and left communism in order to criticize Stalinism because they had just discovered what had happened under Stalin. After the secret presentation by Khrushchev and all the information came out about what Stalin had done over the last 50 years in the USSR, many people left communism, abandoned it, and decided to be aside themselves with liberal morality. And what MacIntyre is trying to do in this essay is to show how that position isn't any really different from Stalinism. The central idea here is that between the moral is and the moral ought. And what has happened in modernity is that they have been separated. So MacIntyre begins this essay by saying that for the Stalinists, the actual course of history is the horizon of morality. That what belongs to the future is progressive is made into a necessary truth. For the moral critic, the question of the course of history, of what is actually happening, and the question of what ought to happen are totally independent questions. Here, MacIntyre sets up a parallel between the Stalinists and the moral critic of Stalinism in light of their views of history. And so for the Stalinists, history becomes that which justifies what we do. And so the idea here might be that the ends justifies the means. And for a Stalinist or someone committed to his policies, the idea of the communist society that is supposed to arise at the end of history justifies any action that moves us closer to that history. So what belongs to the future is always progressive. That's a necessary truth. And so as long as we're moving in that direction, this argument would go, then we are within the bounds of morality. So there's a distinction here between history and morality. Similarly, the moral critic divorces the what ought to happen question from the what actually is happening question. Again, divorcing the history from the moral ought. This then ties into the concept of liberal morality. Now we have to remember here, of course, that when MacIntyre is talking about liberal morality, he's talking about both conservatives and liberals that we might say today, or Republicans and Democrats. And what he's trying to do here is show what's common between liberal morality in general and communism or under Stalinism. And so this traces back to the idea of classical liberalism, which is freedom of the market and freedom of the individual, which we find defined in the modern period, particularly by people like John Locke or J.S. Mill. In discussing liberal morality, he said, the hold of this pattern on the mind is enormously strengthened by the fact that it is the pattern of liberal morality which prevails in our society. For it is the essence of the liberal tradition that morality is taken to be autonomous. What does he mean by this? Well, what he means is that the ought is taken to be autonomous from any fact. And we're going to get into more detail about what he means by fact here in just a minute. But it's the central question that Hume asked. How is ought derived from is? And Hume ends his discussion by saying that it's impossible for ought to be derived from is. And so fact and values are completely separate. So if you look at the movie Thank You for Smoking and look up on YouTube the ice cream scene, and you see Nick Naylor, our antagonist of the movie, or anti-hero, talking to his son about moral flexibility. And the concept of moral flexibility is the idea that you can use your morals to justify any position. That's a result of the divorce between ought and is. It doesn't matter what the facts of the case are. All that matters is what kind of moral justification you're trying to give to it. If you think back to Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason, this would be the same idea that he has in relationship to using our values as marketing tools. We see a similar situation in the movie Grosse Point Blank, where John Cusack justifies his life as an assassin because he has moral flexibility. And finally, we can see in examples from Food Inc. The application of moral flexibility. So the right to property justifies a company like Monsanto arguing that because their seeds flew into someone else's field by the wind, that now that field belongs to them, the crops that come from there belong to them, and they deserve some form of payment from that. What we see here then is morality used to justify a pre-given position. And MacIntyre's point here is that this is the essence of liberal morality because we have divorced fact from value. So he continues by saying that in the end, our most general and ultimate principles, the right to life, the right to free speech, because they are that in terms of which all else is justified, stand beyond any rational justification. In particular, they cannot be justified by any appeal to facts, historical or otherwise. And so again, what MacIntyre is trying to say here is that justification lies outside of any connection to facts. And he's going to argue, of course, that this is wrong. When he says that it stands outside of any rational justification, he has in mind arguments that he's going to make 20 years, 30 years later in After Virtue, and even in 2017 in his book Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity, that the morality, the moral systems of the modern period, whether we're talking about Kantian deontology and its heirs, Rawlsian or Habermasian liberalism, or we're talking about Mill's utilitarianism and its heirs in the contemporary period, or even if we're talking about, to a great extent, Marxist morality, the rationality there fails at a certain point because it depends upon a leap of faith. It depends on accepting a particular principle as the ultimate principle that cannot be justified in any way. It's a first principle for each of them. So Mill's greatest happiness principle is equally justified to him as is Kant's categorical imperative. And they're equally justifiable because the system is closed and it has nothing by which it can refer to everyday life to seek justification. I'm sure if you took a few moments, you can think of examples in your own life where this might be the case, or examples from other movies. Such ideas are quite popular in action movies, of course, but in other kinds of movies. Those of you who are in my class and watching this video, you can think about examples for your own research. MacIntyre goes on then to say that the moral principles of Kantianism or utilitarianism, or whatever moral principles we come to, are completely isolated from the facts of the existence of people, and that people simply accept one set of principles rather than another in some kind of arbitrary fashion. And this is, again, something that he continues to argue later in his works After Virtue in 1982 and Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity in 2017. What liberal morality leads to is the same thing that Stalinism leads to, and that is a failure of human agency. So MacIntyre writes that, first of all, for both, that is, for Stalinism and liberal morality, human agency is essentially ineffective. History occurs, whether theory can grasp it or not, independent of human will and desire. For both, a favorite charge is utopianism, the accusation of trying to extend the sphere of human initiative in ways beyond those which history will allow for. And for both, too often have enormous faith in the levers of social engineering, the empiricist in the ad hoc way, the Stalinist systematically. So again here, what he's trying to argue is that when we separate history from morality, then we become liable to making agency meaningless, because human agency happens within history. And the idea here is that we use our will and our desire to move history in the direction that we want. So in this sense, MacIntyre is fully committed to the Marxian idea that human beings create their own history, and they create their own lives, even if it's in situations of their own choosing. Stalinism can claim of liberalism that it's utopian, because what liberalism is trying to do is to make human beings live in a way that is inhuman. And liberalism will make the same charge against Stalinism and against communism and Marxism. And what happens here is that because they're divorced from human history, they cannot make any judgments about the other except for how they might engineer society. And so the Stalinist, of course, engineered society with his 5-year plan and revised that 5-year plan over and over. And the liberal uses experts to try to engineer society along neoliberal principles. Okay, and so what we get here then is, again, the fact that agency is lost. And that means that what we do in life has no relevance. This is a feeling, I think, that many people, particularly among the millennial generation, share, that there's simply nothing that they can do to change things because it's already in a system. And MacIntyre, being true to his Marxist tradition and his Aristotelian tradition here, is saying that's not true. We've bought into, to be frank, bullshit theory from both liberal morality and Stalinist morality, that we have no power to change things. And what he wants to do is to say that that results from the idea of divorcing history from the moral ought. Okay, so the believer in the autonomy of morality attempts to treat his fundamental moral principles as without any basis. The ought of morality is divorced from desire, and that's how we end up in taboos. That taboos are an expression of morality that is more permanent and long run than human desires. And so at the center of MacIntyre's theory here is the idea that desires as facts are tied to our moral ought. That if we cannot make the link between what we desire and what we ought to do, then we're going to lose any sense of happiness. And this, again, is a very Aristotelian conception, right? Because Aristotle says that our morality, our flourishing, begins with the facts of our desires. And so MacIntyre traces out this idea with how morals have changed. So do this because it will bring you happiness is the Aristotelian point away. And then Augustine and Thomas changed this to do this because God enjoins it as the way to happiness. And what happens in modernity with the Reformation is that we do this because God says so. And finally today, because we've given up any belief in God, we simply do this. And so what MacIntyre wants to do is talk about our history of desire and where that comes from, and trying to find ways to reconnect with our desire. And so what he wants to do is to return us to our deepest desires here. So one meets the anarchist individualist desires which a competitive society breeds in us by rediscovery of the deeper desire to share what is common in humanity. And that's the foundation of MacIntyre's thought, which is denied in our everyday life. And we see this in the relationship between Nick Naylor and his son, and Nick Naylor and Heather Holloway, and we see it in neoliberalism